When America's founding fathers wrote the Bill of Rights, they intended for all of them to be respected, honored, and upheld. They never could have imagined that some would pick and choose which articles of the Bill of Rights they would honor and which they would ignore. The framers of our Constitution would be shocked and appalled at how these clear rights had been violated little by little over the years. A speedy trial is rare. Excessive bail is the norm. Our jails are overflowing with citizens who languish behind bars because they're unable to afford bail, with the system unable to bring them to trial.
Due process at its very core is at the very least, the absolute right to have notice, of what the charges are, issued. But for purposes of what we're doing here, it's much bigger than that, And as we proceed, I always have a question in the back of your mind: how much process is due? Because when you're talking about due process, that's the question that you're really talking about. Is how much process is due. And so if it's a civil case and your property's at stake, you get some kind of due process. If your liberty's at stake or your life is at stake, much more process is due. You have a right to a lawyer. What about a right to a fair trial? Or what about a right to a speedy trial? And so these are questions that are at the very core of what the American Republic is all about. That's how we're different.
If you look at the Declaration of Independence, the whole enumeration of the violations that make up the biggest part of the document, every one of those is accusing the king and the Parliament of a violation of their due process. So that idea of an overreaching government or a government out of balance is how our whole country was created to begin with. And the question is, if that's the foundation, and you get the Constitution, then you get the Bill of Rights, which is supposed to be additional handcuffs on the centralized government to make sure they didn't, break out of those bondages again. And then you look, here we are 200, 300 years later, and we find ourselves dealing with the exact same issues that the colonists at the very beginning were dealing with the overbearing British crown. And so it's like almost what goes around comes around, but no, the dots are not connected to that founding principles.
Due process is supposed to prevent the abuses and excesses that came before us to say you can do everything all the way up to the death penalty in America. But there has to be a due process that pursues equality and justice.
For Americans for Prosperity, I think we really go back to that and our vision of a constitutional nation and society where everyone is being treated equally. And I think, we can see that we went back to due process at the Fifth Amendment. We went back to due process in our understanding of it again at the 14th Amendment. And we've come to a place now where we're continuing to develop what due process really means and what we need to offer people in order for that vision of a constitutional America to exist in the future.
Due process means everyone is treated equally under the law, and everyone is heard and has their day in court, and everyone has presumption of innocence. All of those things are true, but how do you take a system and fix it when you have rogue elements within the system that it won't matter if it's fixed?
The people implementing due process are people. They're fallen, I know, it's just like all of us, okay? I mean, nobody's perfect, there's always going to be issues or problems. And so the question is, how do you get a system or something in place to try to minimize that as much as possible? You're never going to get rid of every bad situation or case or story.
And part of what due process is fairness and making sure that the person who has the power, who's exercising the power and the full force of the government, is doing it in a way that's fair. And when it works, fantastic. When it doesn't, you have the story.
A lot of us just don't simply run in circles where we talk to people on an everyday basis that has been in this situation. And I think that that's why it's become political in some regard, because we don't know personal stories. Dave's got great examples, but I think the average person probably haven't sat down with somebody who had a personal experience like that. And so I think the art of storytelling, as they call it, make it personal so that people actually know somebody who's been in this situation.
I think a due process depends on who's saying it. Some people think due process means you can stay in the court system for years. I wonder what the friends and relatives of the people in jail for January 6th think due process means.
It's part of our problem.
Agree.
And how do we get past that, or we, the center right, are leading on this to do the great thing?
Due process is about fairness, and it's not about the left or the right. It's a question of how do we get to a place where we can actually reform the system so that we get to fairness.
This has become a political thing. I think as much as we can stand up for the little guy, to kind of avoid the political end of this, and if we stand up for that guy that's handing out pamphlets, or the indigent person who maybe did a misdemeanor but can't afford to get up, the rest of it may take care of itself.
We're focusing on procedure due process, and you know, wherever we go with this, we ought not let somebody else hijack the mission by adding substantive due process so that they can advance their either left-leaning or right-leaning, you know, ideas in an improper way.
It's difficult to see some of these rights being taken away and some of these processes being skipped over, in the argument of expediency and political correctness. And I think that that's something that hopefully this group can push back on a little bit more.
If we really turn up the volume on this conversation a little bit, we can build a better prepared and a more consistently principled base to support those who are working to protect our rights.